The scripture passages in Matthew 14:27, where Jesus is walking on the water in the midst of the storm, and the disciples become terrified. If you recall the words of the Lord, take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. See, that's part of courage also, is the recognition that in the midst of the danger, in the midst of the trouble, that God is there, and he would have to say, take courage, take heart, don't be afraid, I am with you. That's one of the things that God in the Old Testament had to always keep saying to the children of Israel as they made their way through the desert. You know, what are you afraid of? I'm with you. I've sent my angel before you, follow, and do not be afraid. And so prudence and courage would have been important abilities and virtues that Joseph would have had and been endowed with to help him then to be a good guide and a good guardian, a good husband and a good father. So we move out of Matthew's gospel then into some of the early parts of Luke and the announcement of Jesus' birth. We begin with, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel again was sent from God to a town of Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man named Joseph, the house of David, and the virgin's name was Mary. And after this time, we've already gone through Joseph's side of all of this and how he comes to accept what God is calling to him. But it's not too long after this, when Joseph and Mary come together, that we have that, in Luke's gospel, we have the edict from Caesar Augustus, where everyone has to go back to their hometowns to register and to be counted. And so in Luke 2:1-14, we have the account of Jesus' birth. And in verse 4, it says, Joseph too went from Galilee, from a town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David that is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and the family of David. And we went through this appellation, or this name, Joseph, son of David, this morning. And so another virtue that is portrayed here by Luke, although the word is not mentioned, is the word obedience, which is in some ways today is a misunderstood virtue. It's much like prudence. Far too many people today think that obedience it limits their freedom, that it requires them to hand over their rights to somebody else. But obedience is not just a religious or a spiritual virtue. It's also just keeps us alive in our everyday life. That was last summer one time. I was going from where I am north of Amarillo down, I can't think of the name now, but it goes down to I-40 to Sam's. And I was on 10th and Osage. And I was on Osage going south, and 10th goes, and the light turned in my favor, and so I just pulled out, and the intersection was going, and all of a sudden there was an ambulance right there. I didn't hear him and I didn't see him, but he was right there. I had just pulled out into the intersection of 10th and Osage, and I was right in there, and that ambulance was like from here to that post, and the guy in there was going. So he kept going this way, and so they left me get out of the way, and away they went again. But you see, I can't tell you how many times in my life it's been that close. You know, do you ever have those experiences driving where if you don't see or hear too good, obedience, you know, if you obey the traffic signs, it keeps you safe. Of course, if the light turned green, I didn't know the difference. I should have, because if I could hear, I would have heard that thing coming. But obedience is important. Just think of road signs. people jump road signs all the time, and cause there are lawyers in Amarillo who are making a living dealing with wrecks with motorcycles. I mean, every summer and spring, people are being killed because they're not obeying stop signs. Well, if you foo-foo obedience, it's not just dangerous, you put your life in real danger. And so it's, I remember hearing, I was listening to, I don't remember what denomination he belonged to, but I every once in a while would listen to him on radio, and he was talking about obedience, and he said, obedience is important in our life, just if we're like the man who wouldn't obey. He didn't believe that gravity existed, and he wasn't going to obey it. They said, well, if that man got up on top of the Empire State Building and jumped off on the way down, he would believe. Because he'd find out, gravity does exist. And some of the things we're called upon to be obedient to are not just there because it takes away freedom, it's there to give us the freedom to stay alive. And so what Joseph is pointing out here is that it's obedience not only to God's law, but he also obeyed the emperor and went as the emperor asked to be enrolled in their hometown in Bethlehem because he was of the house and the family of David. And so he's obedient also to the civil law, which is something that Paul and both Paul and Peter have in their letters in the New Testament. And is it Paul who said, "No, don't only obey them, but pray for them"? Why? Not because they're doing everything right and you don't agree with what they're doing, but because they're there at that moment by God's choice. And God will deal with them if they are leading people astray. And so it's obedience is an important virtue for all of us, and it's especially obedient in the life of Joseph, because in obedience he was able then to keep his family safe. And so it's not just an idea of limiting freedom, but it is actually a way of keeping ourselves and our families and our communities safe. And so when we talk about God's law, the purpose of God's law is to help us reach our ultimate destination, which is heaven. And that's why we obey the law of God. We obey civil law because it keeps us safe in this world. We obey traffic law because it keeps us from getting run over by an ambulance. And we obey God's law because it leads us into our ultimate purpose, and that is everlasting life with God in heaven. So the virtue of obedience also requires a great deal of trust. Lack of trust on the part of our first parents is what caused all of mankind to fall into the sinfulness that is destroying God, or has sought to destroy God's good creation. In the garden, they were tricked into disobeying God when the evil one instilled in their minds a doubt regarding God's trustworthiness and his love for them. The serpent, and he does that to us also. He takes something that God said and twists it a little bit. Did God say that you should not eat of any of the fruit in the garden and then you would die? And the woman points out, no, God didn't say that. He said we can eat of any of the fruit except for the tree that's in the middle of the garden. God didn't say you can eat of anything or you can't eat nothing. And when we are aware of how the evil one works in the life, and especially in those who are close and striving to be close to God, we have to trust in God's trustworthiness and in his total care for us. And that our obedience then is to God in what he truly is asking of us and what he's truly asking us to be and to live. It's a search for the truthfulness of God and the trust that it takes to be obedient. And so Mary and Joseph both trusted God and were willing to suffer for their obedience to God. They were certain that God had their best interest in mind, and so both of them did as God was asking them, whether it was the angel Gabriel who was asking, or whether it was the angel of the Lord. Both Our Lady and Saint Joseph, trusting that God is the one who has asked them to do these things, then they are then not only responsible, but they actually carry out to bring about the safety of God's Son, who is destined as the one who becomes, or who is, the Messiah of God. We have Pope Benedict XVI made this remark: why was St. Matthew so keen to note Joseph's interest in the words received from the messenger of God in a dream, if not to invite us to imitate that same loving trust? And so when we read these passages about how trustful Joseph was, how trusting Mary was, it's not just that we can say, well, isn't that wonderful how trustful they were? It's a call to us to imitate in our own lives the trust, the obedience, the prudence, and the courage that these saints portray for us, and that we can trust that God will give us those same virtues to be able to carry out the things that he calls us to do in our own vocations. There's an example from St. Faustina, who loved St. Joseph. She had a very deep devotion to St. Joseph, and she frequently turned to him for his intercession, asking him to help her do the will of God and to be faithful to the mission of spreading devotion to God's mercy. She was able to complete her mission and be obedient to her superiors, even when they did not believe her, and they also sent her many times for psychological evaluation because they thought she was losing her mind. This is a sister who suffered greatly because of the disbelief of her own community in what Jesus was asking her to do. And she was told by Jesus himself that when she wrote the diary, she put down, if you've ever read the diary, it's a magnificent little book, but she was told by Jesus that when that diary was translated from Polish into Latin, that it was going to be neglected and rejected. And that really happened. The first translation of St. Faustina's diary into Latin was an absolutely horrendous translation. We talked yesterday about any of you who have done translations. Whoever translated that Polish into Latin just absolutely blotched it. And if it hadn't been for Karol Wojtyla, who became St. John Paul II, if it hadn't been for him, we would not even know of St. Faustina. Because, as you know, St. John is Polish. And he read the original diary in the original Polish, and he absolutely figured out what had happened. And it was Pope John Paul II who commissioned a better translation of that diary into Latin, and it was first then when people figured out that they had besmirched the reputation and the diary itself. And so if after that, then they began to translate it into other languages and paid more attention, because evidently Polish must be one of those languages that is it's kind of like German. It's very difficult to get it into English because of they're two different. It's just two different cultures, and it's two different mindsets that we don't think like they do, and they don't think like us do, like we do. And so it makes it very difficult to put their ideas into our ideas, and that's what happened. And not only that, but they put it in Latin first before they went into the vernacular, so it just became a total debacle. And John Paul II is the one then who figured that out. And because of him, after he became Pope, when he had the authority, see, when he was still Archbishop or Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, he knew what was going on, but it wasn't until he became Pope that he had the authority to straighten this out. And because of that, we then learned of St. Faustina and how much courage it took for her to do what the Lord Jesus was asking of her. I think at several times, even her confessor thought she was losing her mind. So it must have been a tremendous struggle. And it will be that way for anyone who is asked to do these kinds of things for God. I mean, Joseph and Mary, I mean, for heaven's sake, to us, I don't know about you, but I have not found priesthood to be all that comfortable. And I don't mean that as a jab or it's just not, it's not easy. Well, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, it takes courage to be consecrated to God. You too, and me too, I too. You know, one of the things, I'm going to get lost again, but one of the things I've noticed with married couples, about 20 years ago, if you talk to a husband, he would always say, my wife and I. If he was talking about their relation or what they were doing as a family, he would always say, my wife and I. If you talk to a husband in this day and time, it's me and my wife. It has totally swapped. It's a real indication of where our culture has gone. It's me, mine, and mine now. Where before that it was her and I, or her and me, her, my wife. And a lot of times he would use her name. You know, Margaret and I, or Mary and I, or Elizabeth and I. And now it's just me and my wife. It's how culture can change it, and sometimes it takes courage to live against or contrary to these kinds of things. I remember one of my spiritual directors years ago, when I had a spiritual director, told me that it's the brave ones who swim against the current. It's the dead that just float with the current. So courage is a call to be alive and to be willing to spend the energy to be on God's side and to be with God. And even if it means swimming against the current, it's a call to see. Our will and human prudence would say, oh, don't worry about it, just let's float with the flow. How does that go? Flow with the current, or how does that go? Flow. Yeah, just come see, come saw, you know, whatever, you know. But anyone who's walking with prudence and courage and obedience is going to be a person who can set themselves against, and I don't mean in a belligerent way, I mean just to live life as God is calling us, and not as just the times. And it's not just for us today. This has been true since Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. I mean, Cain and Abel, they didn't get along, and the first murder occurred. Lamech, who bragged that if Cain can kill one guy, I can kill 7. He was bragging to his wife about that. And so it's gone downhill from there. And has it gotten any better? In a little book that I was reading by Pope Benedict XVI, he was bemoaning the fact that after all of the centuries of Christianity and Catholicism in Europe, and looking at Europe today, what good has it done? I mean, the poor man was absolutely sick. I wonder sometimes if that's not what killed him. You know? I mean, and can we say it's any better in this country? Because you know, some of these virtues that are exemplified for us in the life of Mary and Joseph are not even accounted as important in this day and time. I was talking about the commandments this morning. Thou shalt not steal. One of the biggest crimes that is occurring nowadays in California, and it happened in Dallas. It was in one of the jewelry stores over Advent time, a high-priced jewelry store. Some of these rings are like $10,000 and $12,000 for a little thing, you know. and some of the diamonds. I mean, this is a very ritzy, classy, if you want to call it that, high-priced place, and there was 30 people came storming in there with baseball bats and sledgehammers and smashed the whole place up and stole every one of those, every bit of it. And they even took the trash cans with them. And the cops are still looking for him, and that happened back in October. There was another place in Dallas, the same thing happened. And talk about thou shalt not steal. Even God's commandments are not being obeyed at all in this day and time. Amarillo is getting as dangerous as all get out. In my area of town in North, if I don't turn the news on Monday evening to listen to the news and there hasn't been a gunfight in my area of town, then it hadn't been a good weekend. And I say that sarcastically. I mean, we've got 15 and 16-year-old boys roaming around the parks in Amarillo with AR-15s, which is a military-style assault weapon, at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning looking for somebody to shoot. Where in God's name is our culture going? And so it's, in this day and time, courage is something it takes a lot of just for you and I to claim we're Catholic. It's really, it's one of the things that someone like Pope Benedict XVI, John Paul II, I think even in certain ways, Pope Francis also, in some ways, is trying to get us to see some of this. And so it's not to get all upset about it, but it's realize that courage is an important virtue in this day and time also. And maybe another virtue that, what are we supposed to end at, 3:10?
3:10, 3:15.
I think I'm talking long again today. Yeah, I got 3 minutes. I just wanted this
Take
last.
whatever time you need.
I wanted to, I don't remember where, it had something to do with John Paul, St. John Paul, and the courage that it takes to be Catholic. And this was after the Second World War. St. John Paul, when he related this in one of his books. After the Second World War, when the whole Cold War situation set up, and you had the United States and the Allies on one side, and you had the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union had moved into Poland and East Germany and took that whole area over. And they went in Poland, they started a systematic destruction and killing of all the priests. And the priests were being arrested and rounded up, and they were either being shot or they were being put in some concentration camp or a gulag in Siberia. So it left all of the people in their parishes without priests. Well, the people seeing that this was coming and recognizing what was happening, the people in those parishes, they went to their parish church, and every family took something like the vestments, the sacred vessels. Even in one case, they managed to get the Blessed Sacrament, and one family took that home, and they hid all that stuff out, so the authorities couldn't destroy it. And then on all the holidays, especially the holidays that Poland holds sacred, the people would come together, and sometimes it would be in a bombed out parish church, and maybe the piece of the altar was still there. And they would lay the color of vestments of the day on the altar, and then they would all kneel down and say the rosary. And then they would spend some time in silent prayer, and then they would get up, pick up all the vestments, and go home. And that's how the Catholic Church, through the courage of their people, survived that disaster. And I think the East Germans did the same thing. And so it is courage. It takes courage in those kinds of situations, and it takes patience, and it takes obedience to the call of God, because they could very easily have said, what's the use in all of this? We got no priests, let's just go home and mind our own business. But they didn't. With courage, they stayed Catholic. And they stayed Polish Catholic. That is really important. They stayed Polish Catholic. And it's as important as that in my family. Some of my family stayed German Catholic in that very same situation. And so when we look at Joseph and Mary, and especially as we've been dealing with St. Joseph through these days, Joseph was a man of courage and a man of patience and a man of prudence. And that's why he was capable of being a very good husband, a loving husband for Our Lady, and a wonderful, wonderful tutor and model for not only our Lord, but for us too. So we'll look at some more of this tomorrow morning. Glory to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.